Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Racing News 365 podcast, looking back at last weekend's United States Grand Prix, but also looking ahead to this weekend's race in Mexico City. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by 2023 Young Journalist of the Year, Sam absolutely Coop. I've said that once, I'm going to say it again. And of course, lead editor Ian Parks. Gentlemen, what a weekend. Storylines off the circuit, but thankfully, mostly on the circuit. So much for us to discuss. And I guess the easiest way of starting this podcast is with our biggest takeaways from last weekend, because Ian, where do you begin?
Thanks. I'm glad you come to me first, just to let people know that Nick and I, and obviously Sam, but Nick and I are recording this podcast in particular, as Nick has pointed out, just 10 hours after we did the F1 update at 2 a.m. UK time. So we're just approaching noon on Monday afternoon as we record this. Nick and I are just a little bit tired. Sam is super fresh because he had the Grand Prix weekend off. So he's going to be coming at everything, folks, with fresh eyes, fresh perspective. So I'm actually going to hand over to Sam first, because he can take the lead on this one, and you can give me a minute while I think about what my takeaway is.
This can be the Sam Coop Racing News 365 podcast this week. Show, yeah.
Well, no pressure.
No, go for it.
Biggest take home of the weekend is that, quite simply, the lay of the land just is not evolving in the direction McLaren need it to. We've come back from this autumn break, and it isn't. They don't have the hand. It's not where they need it to be. Red Bull, or rather, let's say Max Verstappen, has enough in his locker, and I think he'll be able to see it out. I think by the time we get to the end of this triple header, it will be looking pretty much done and dusted. And part of that lay of the land is also Ferrari. They will be there or thereabouts, probably more often than not. Yes, it's a track coated that suits Ferrari and not McLaren, but the biggest take home is that McLaren just don't have enough at this stage.
I'll give Ian a couple more seconds to think, because I'll butt in with my biggest takeaway, and I'm going to go for the rise of the rookies, Liam Lawson, the return of Liam Lawson. This is why I want to get in first, because Liam Lawson on his return, absolutely phenomenal performance, which we will discuss in this podcast. And the same for Franco Colapinto. He's not a bad driver, it seems, and I think Williams are going to be slightly starting to wish that maybe they hadn't decided their lineup for next season so soon. Ian, all the pressure over for you. Come on then, biggest takeaway.
While Sam was talking, I actually thought, I know what I'm going to go with. I was going to go with not biggest takeaway, but just to something different, because obviously Sam has pretty much covered the main talking point, the biggest takeaway. Yes, obviously McLaren not in the position he wants to be. Then I was going to go on to the rookie. So you bugger, you've stolen my thunder. So where do I go from there? What is left for me?
Ferrari.
Coming at it. They are right in that mix now. That's absolutely for certain. 48-point difference between McLaren in first place and Ferrari in third. And I know, yes, we did touch on it in the update post Grand Prix, you and I, Nick, as to the rise of Ferrari, and if it can replicate that performance over these next 5 Grand Prix, because boy, it certainly looked like it had got the legs on both McLaren and Red Bull. Even though if we go back previous 3 weeks, and McLaren was head and shoulders above all of its rivals, but that just goes to show the swings and roundabouts nature that we've enjoyed for the most part of this season. Red Bull, we've talked about them previously, fighting with one hand tied behind its back, simply because it only has Max Verstappen in the mix. Sergio Perez again struggling over the course of this weekend. But Ferrari, both drivers, Charles Leclerc, Carlos Sainz, really on it all weekend. Great pace, great performance from the Scuderia. As I say, 48 points in the Constructors' Championship, the difference. They are really in that battle for that Constructors' title this year. And Charles Leclerc, 79 points adrift of Max Verstappen. You've got to think it's too much for Charles to overhaul Max, but he could overhaul Lando Norris for second. I know it never really means anything, but at the end of the day, he's going to be wanting to go for it, and he's only 22 points behind Lando. We've talked about Lando so much being the main title protagonist. Well, here we go. Charles Leclerc is less than a Grand Prix victory now behind Lando Norris.
Yeah.
So yes, these 5 Grand Prix, 2 sprints remaining, Ferrari absolutely are in the mix, most definitely for the constructors' title, and with a real, you got to think, outside shot for the drivers with Charles. But in all honesty, I can't see that one happening, to be fair to Charles.
Ferrari were so dominant on Sunday. In fact, they were so dominant to the point they actually got pretty minimal screen time because the cameras were always on Lando and Max, particularly in the latter stages. And of course, yes, there was the turn 1, lap 1 incident where Lando, as we discussed, Ian, just left Max way too much room. Both went wide. Charles Leclerc breezed up the inside. Thank you very much. Stormed to victory. But the big talking point was, of course, lap 52 and turn 12. Lando attempting to go around the outside of Max, both drivers going off the circuit. Lando rejoining ahead of Max, getting a 5-second time penalty as a result for gaining an advantage off the circuit, which demoted him after the race from 3rd to 4th behind the reigning world champion. We actually asked our viewers last night whether they think the penalty was correct for Lando. And interestingly, at the moment, and this poll was some massive numbers, by the way, so it's clearly a massive talking point, but 51% of our viewers think that, yes, the penalty was the correct call. 44% think no. 5% are not sure. I'm on the fence a little bit. I see why it was given personally. However, I just wish that whilst, okay, yes, gravel probably isn't possible there because, as you mentioned, obviously in the F1 update, MotoGP, for them, it just simply isn't safe. And obviously, COTA is used by several categories. I just wish the fact the stewards were able to give the penalty before the end of the race, they could see that what Lando did in their viewing wasn't right. Just tell McLaren to make him give the place up. Don't bring this penalty in. Let's see a last lap fight. Then it probably would have been. Why the time penalty? Sam, for someone who obviously was watching the race at home, obviously not working last weekend, from more of the fan perspective, what did you make of the incident?
So I immediately thought it was a racing incident. I didn't think Lando should give the place back. And I thought when the penalty came through that was harsh. I think what's really interesting is how divided, understandably, Andrea Stella and Christian Horner are on the incident. Christian Horner defended what he has called a slam dunk decision, basically saying, well, of course, the stewards came to a quick decision. It was a slam dunk, and actually props to them for doing so because they're often criticised for leaving these things till after the race. Conversely, Andrea Stella has come out and said, where's the urgency to intervene in something that basically has championship permutations? He was like, we have the polar opposite view compared to how the FIA has decided this. And I think really consequentially, he was going to say that actually, if anything, we thought Max was at fault and we told Oscar to pull up within 5 seconds because we anticipated a penalty for Max. Going back to how I viewed it as an armchair or sofa watcher for the occasional time, I just felt like there wasn't enough to say that ultimately Max only was ahead at the apex because he wasn't going to make the corner. It's very difficult to tell, and if you watch the replays, I go back and forth between whether or not Lando would have also made the apex or made the corner at least. So that's difficult, but I just don't think there's enough to say, yes, he's at fault or he's taken it too far. I think this is Max doing what Max does. He knows the rules very, very well. I just don't think in this instance it's enough to say, yeah, no, that's a penalty.
And it was crucial as well. I noted, I was going to say there's a key comment from Andrea Stella, having read Sam's piece this morning based on the quotes from Andrea post-Grand Prix, where Andrea basically challenged the media and he said, if you're a journalist, go and look back at all those incidents where Max has not effectively taken the apex cleanly and see how many times he has forced another driver off the circuit the way he's done, and then obviously forced that other driver to either take a different line or, make the maneuver off track, etc. The thing is with this particular incident, and it's the same with the other incidents that took place in the US Grand Prix as well, is this grey area within the regulations. And I'm just, for the viewers and the listeners, just going to read out, because I think it's worth actually doing this rather than trying to paraphrase, to read out the wording within the steward's document. And it says, Norris was overtaking Verstappen on the outside, but was not level with Verstappen at the apex. Therefore, under the driving standards guidelines, and that's capped out because this is something that the drivers adhere to with regard to on-track stuff like this, Norris had lost the right to the corner. Accordingly, as Norris left the track and returned in front of Verstappen, it is deemed to be a case of leaving the track and gaining a lasting advantage. It's all about that apex. So in the driving standards guidelines, this is what the drivers adhere to. Verstappen had got the apex. As I mentioned in the update, approaching the corner about 15, 20 meters away, Norris had just marginally got the nose of his McLaren in front of Verstappen, but under braking, as they hit the apex, absolutely, Verstappen was in front. However, here comes that grey area. What then follows? Yes, Verstappen got the apex, but as Sam rightly pointed out, his acceleration and deceleration under braking ensured that he could not make the corner, and conversely, he pushed Norris wide. However, Lando did overtake off track, did not give the place back. And for the stewards, when they're looking at those driving standards guidelines, that for them was a slam dunk penalty. Is this now an area under those driving standards guidelines because of this where it now needs to be cleared up going forward? And unfortunately, just commenting on Andrea Stella's point, as journalists, it's going to take us an awful long time to go back up through all the Grand Prix that Max Verstappen has competed in to see how many times he might have forced another driver off track. Would love to do it. Would love to have that time. But sorry, Andrea, it's not going to take place. But I'm sure there's been more than what occurred during the USGP with Lando Norris on Sunday.
Definitely not doing a triple header.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, I mean, not saying Andrea's obviously not incredibly busy, but yeah, I mean, I don't think he's worked as a journalist before. So, but I certainly think this needs to be looked at. I completely agree with you on that point. I just don't. There's a lot of criticism that's come out of McLaren saying, they should have immediately told Lando to give it back, and a lot of was kind of pinned on McLaren telling Lando that he was ahead at the apex, and he wasn't. He absolutely was not ahead at the apex, and obviously I've discussed why he wasn't already. I don't think McLaren did anything wrong by not telling Lando to give the place back. I would have said, look, this is debatable. Get 5 seconds down the road. Just absolutely put your foot down, try and build that gap, which he did. He just fell short.
4.1 at the checkered flag. Yeah,
I think I think Nick, you have a really interesting point that you made before the start of the show. So I think it's worth you coming in here about the steward's intervention and when that should have come.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because obviously you mentioned Andrea Stella, and obviously he said immediately after the race that the steward's action getting involved so quickly in a beautiful piece of motorsport was inappropriate. Toto Wolff also gave his views and obviously kind of raised a little bit of argument about bias. And obviously we know the history there between Mercedes and Red Bull. And you look at the incidents obviously with Max in the past, and majority are with Lewis, particularly in 2021. But what's really interesting for me is we want to see racing. We all do. We want to see the results concluded on the circuit rather than in the steward's room hours after the race. And I think on the one hand, the stewards need to be given some credit, the fact that on this occasion, the penalty was at least given before the checker flag. So when that checker flag flew, we knew that Lando had fallen behind Max. However, given that obviously McLaren believed they had this argument they could have fought with, you just wonder, why don't, if the stewards could see so quickly that Lando gained an advantage off the circuit, he shouldn't have had that position, get McLaren to tell him to give the place back to Max and then let them fight again. Let them restart their battle, because ultimately that will make a better spectacle for the fans. It will make it obviously I don't know what best for journalists is the right answer because we've got loads of stories out of this, but
it's not about us, is it?
but it does raise the argument where for the fans there to know that the driver who finished third didn't finish third, just let them battle, let them fight. If, both drivers went off the circuit, okay, Lando did get past Max, make him get back the position, go again. And we saw, on several occasions, as Ian mentioned, turn 12 during the race, and not for the first time, caused so many problems. And for me, it goes back to the argument of, okay, yes, whilst perhaps a gravel trap isn't appropriate there, and that's a big problem now with so many modern day circuits where it's not just F1 using them, there are obviously a lot of bike categories as well. There has to be a solution for track limits, because quite clearly having these giant runoff areas creates more problems than it solves, as we saw during the sprint, as we saw during qualifying, during the race. And the question is, how do you solve that? Because clearly gravel isn't the option. Is there an alternative that can be used? But there's got to be something that's going to make drivers not want to go off the circuit, because let's say, for example, there was a gravel trap there. Well, Max then isn't going to go deep into the corner, whether it's on purpose or not. He's not going to do that, because that's then impacting not only his exit, but actually that's then making his tyres dirty because he's going to touch gravel. Whereas Lando physically wouldn't be able to go that far off the circuit because, well, he'd either become beached in the gravel or lose significant time. And this is the big question, I think, looking ahead, because we want to see on-track action, but we don't want to see it decided by penalties, in my opinion. Anything to add, either of you?
The only point I would just make, Sarah Sam, I'll just come in just very briefly. The only point I would make with regard to the stewards and the decision-making is that when incidents like that do take place, they give the teams a little bit of time to work out amongst themselves what should happen. So in this particular case, they gave McLaren, I would assume, about half a lap, maybe a lap, to work out whether let's say half a lap, probably a lap's way too long, probably half a lap to work out whether, within the conversations that were taking place from the pit wall, Will Joseph, Lando's engineer, to Lando, and Lando back again to Will Joseph, whether they should have given that place back. As I say, they would have given them that little bit of time. So they would have lost half a lap's worth of time assessing that, waiting for the McLaren to make up their mind as to what they were going to do, whether they were going to give the place back or not. Because as I mentioned in the update, it did look, as we came to the end of that lap and at the start of the next one, that for a moment, Lando seemed to hesitate as to whether he was actually considering to give the place back or not.
Yeah.
And if he'd have done so at the top of the hill, going into turn one at the start of the next lap, he would have been in prime position again to have had another run down on that lap back into turn 12. It's all hypothetical, of course, because what's happened has now happened. And obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, you can always view things with 20/20 vision. We know that. But I'm sure Lando, in his heart of hearts, is probably thinking, I just wish I'd given that place back. Too late now, been, gone, done it. But as I say, with regard to the stewards, yes, they would have waited for McLaren to work out what they would have done before then deciding to intervene and look at it themselves.
And to be, go on, Sam.
I was going to say this, but that's the thing. It feels very, very reactive by the stewards. I think Nick is kind of advocating a more proactive stance, where they, and so I guess that's the kind of. I see the merit in both, really. I also see the merit in what Andrea Stella's saying, when there's implications for a championship. Just take the time. It's almost too big a moment to rush a decision. What's difficult is that the stewards are kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't, because some people are going to be saying, oh, well, now we've got to wait. It's not going to be till Monday morning that I'm going to know what the outcome of the race was. And that is exactly what would have happened. And we know that we'd be sitting here having that conversation now. So I think what's difficult is trying to find those lines of distinction in these case-by-case basis. I think that's a really difficult bit. And just very quickly, a sidebar on potential solutions to the runoff area. I'm no engineer, I'm no designer, so this may be completely unfeasible. But is there not a way to have a kind of like the resin type gravel that we've started to see, like the strips, or something that, and it might be quite costly, but almost like turf or something that you can then flip to then have tarmac on. So, with football stadiums, you can move the pitch off and you can do all kinds of clever things. Is there not a way that we can start introducing something that has that deterrent on one side and then the asphalt on the other, and this track just switches it over for whatever series is racing?
So interestingly, Max was actually asked about whether gravel or something is the answer at turn 12, and obviously he raised the point that to make kind of changes like that in an area that large, and it wouldn't just be turn 12, there'll be several corners, not just at Cota, but actually you even look at the Red Bull Ring as another example, but it will be so expensive, making these changes. And of course, Cota has only just undergone some resurfacing at some parts of the circuit, so it's already splashed out a bit of cash. But I've just seen the time. 20 minutes on this topic, and of course we need to look at some other stuff as well, because
I just want to conclude, very quickly conclude. And it was actually a point that Sam raised as well, but I just want to expand on it just for a few seconds. And it's the fact that you can appreciate as well that the steward would likely have been under considerable pressure to have delivered a verdict before the checkered flag. Bearing in mind what country we are in, there's no way, I know from having covered many Grand Prix in the United States now, US fans in particular hate decisions that are taken hours after a race has ended. And you've got to bear in mind as well that, as Sam noted, that for a British European audience, as soon as the checkered flag will have fallen, many people would arguably have switched off, gone to bed, turned over to another channel, and have woken up this morning, Monday morning, and saying, what? Lando was not third. Can you imagine the furore that would have caused? So, as Sam said, damned if they do, damned if they don't. And if it had been the flip side and they had have taken their time, yes, we would have been having a whole different conversation right now, and arguably criticising it for not having made a quicker decision. So it's 6-1, half a dozen of the other on this battle, and I don't think it's one that the stewards are ever going to win, regardless of the situation going forward.
Well, at least for Lando, he has become McLaren's highest point scorer in F1 with 930 points. However, of course, the point system, the point system has changed a bit, but it's a record, it's something. But the biggest thing here is how quickly the narrative has changed, because we've gone from Norris chipping away at Verstappen's lead to all of a sudden now Max has put 5 points on Lando. It's up to 57 points now, and you do wonder. We're going into Mexico City, a circuit where Red Bull and Max have been pretty dominant over recent years. There's every chance, in my opinion, that going through Mexico and then coming out of Brazil, Max needs an 84-point lead coming out of Brazil to win the championship in Sao Paulo. We know how good he is in Mexico. We know how good he is in the sprint format as well, which of course is back in Brazil. It does feel to me now that all of a sudden, it's Max's title, I think, quite clear, unless something dramatic happens. But I think there's a good chance now he could even do it as soon as Brazil, which feels crazy to even say, Sam.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid point. I think what McLaren will defer back to, though, is that what we've spoken about before, of we need to get to Abu Dhabi and be within 26 points. I don't think it changes the ball game for McLaren.
Never going to happen.
But this is the thing. But this is how big these swings of the pendulum are. And you're absolutely right, though, that this has changed the narrative. McLaren needed to come in to the start of this triple header for the 6 and 8 weekends, 6 rounds in 8 weekends.
Yeah,
and take a nice chunk of points out of Max. Even if it had been had that penalty not been applied, it would have been a 51-point advantage, because again Max had a strong sprint. So Lando would have taken a point net over the weekend. That still wouldn't have been enough. I don't think that would have changed the marker in the conversation we're now having about this. It would not have been enough to confidently say, yes, this is a real fight. McLaren are now, where I absolutely agree with you, it's now down to chance for McLaren. They need luck to intervene. They need a Verstappen retirement, even just to keep this going, to get it close. A Lando retirement in the next couple of races, pretty much seals the championship for Max, and he could actually seal it by Brazil.
Well, obviously, Max needs to score 27 points more than Lando across the next 2 races and the sprint in Brazil, which I think is pretty doable. But I think the big problem for McLaren is that actually Ferrari are in this mix. Ferrari are going to be getting amongst the McLarens and Max Verstappen. Just to go through the numbers, Charles Leclerc is 79 points off Max. Lando is 57. Charles is only 22, as you mentioned, Ian, behind Lando. That's a very reachable gap compared to what Lando is behind Max. And you look at the Constructors' Championship and Ferrari's recent pace. I know, of course, Singapore didn't go brilliantly for them, but they were quick. Only had a poor result due to Carlos and Charles messing up in qualifying. But Ferrari are 48 points behind McLaren, only 8 points behind Red Bull in the Constructors. It feels like now so much of this season is dependent on, can Ferrari continue this form and this momentum is really built? Because in COTA, particularly on the Sunday, they were untouchable.
Pretty much. Obviously, didn't quite get it right in sprint qualifying.
Yeah.
And Max ran away with a sprint comfortable victory there. But yes, as I touched on at the start of this podcast, they are now definitely the team in form. The McLaren will definitely be looking over their shoulder. And I'm wondering, with regard to Andrea Stella's comments where he was talking about the stewards should have been taking their time to consider the championship implications, just how much he actually had in mind more the Constructors' Championship and the points lost there, given the situation that occurred where the result was flipped around between Lando and Max at the checkered flag, more than Lando's situation, because this was a weekend with momentum on Lando's side coming out of Singapore, where that momentum, as Lando put it himself, has now been killed to a certain degree because he's not taken any points out of Max at all. In fact, he's lost a further 5 in the championship battle. And I think for Lando, this title is now gone.
Yeah.
I can't see any way in which Max is not going to win his 4th consecutive driver's title. 57 points is, for me, is too much of a gap to bridge. Even if Max retired twice in the next 5 Grand Prix, which is pretty much unthinkable when you look at his history over the past few years and pretty much how bulletproof Red Bull has made its cars, then, as I say, we're looking at something unfathomable in many respects. And I cannot see Lando now overhauling that total. And I think he's actually going to be looking, like McLaren, Lando's going to be looking more behind him at Charles Leclerc and whether he can actually hang on to 2nd place in the driver's standings. Never mind trying to overhaul Max Verstappen in the title. But yes, Ferrari, on that form, at that track, definitely the team to watch. And as I said, they're all, I know, listening to the comments back from Fred and Charles and Carlos, they are looking forward to Mexico this weekend because they feel it's another circuit where they can replicate the performance that they've just achieved over the COTA weekend.
And I suppose the one team who, we know Ferrari are going to be in the mix and getting involved between Max and Lando and Oscar as well. But one team who I suppose at the moment look on paper, not a chance they'll be involved in those battles for some victories across the final 5 races are Mercedes. Have quite clearly taken, as we had a feeling coming out of Singapore, have quite clearly taken another step backwards because a disastrous weekend in COTA, slightly saved for George Russell by finishing 6th after starting from the pit lane, but 2 crashes for Mercedes, 1 for George, 1 for Lewis at the exact same corner. George is in qualifying. Lewis is on the 3rd lap of the race at turn 19. Very similar accidents. And Sam, it raises the question now. They've got 5 races left. They've got Lewis, obviously, going to Ferrari in a couple of months now. Is it time they just put their hands up, accept this year, just despite a couple of wins, hasn't been the one, that mistakes have been made? Is it time now where they just forget about 2024 and put full focus, at least with George, on developing for 2025? Because, we've spoken about Red Bull and the importance of them solving their problems, not just to save this season, but actually for 2025, given how little development we're expecting of the cars next season because of 2026. Are Mercedes now in a very similar position where actually they've got to understand what's causing these problems? Because if they enter next season with similar things going on, then, well, they can write off 2025 as well.
To go back
He
to
was going to say absolutely.
He was going to.
Sam Coop was going to say absolutely, then his followers just hold himself.
But did I?
Not yet. We both did in the update, so I'll put our hands up for that.
Well, there we go then. How it comes around.
It was an honour to you, mate. It was an honour to you.
We were missing you at 3 a.m. in the morning. So,
going back to what I said last week, Mercedes will be building towards 2025 already. I don't think this, admittedly, poor weekend changes or moves the needle much anyway. Luckily, Lewis has already had that kind of that farewell, those 2 wins towards the summer break that you can really kind of pin the season on and say, we went out, our relationship went out with those highlights. So I don't think it changes in that sense. I do think, though, there is some real concerns that have started to develop over the last few weeks. I mean, the hot seat situation that we had for a couple of races where both Lewis and George were saying that the actual cockpit is too hot. My seat is too hot. I mean, that's, curious. The car looks very unsettled. Not only did both of them have the same error, basically, at the same corner, Lewis also spun in practice. That's so unlike Lewis. And it really is, I spoke about pendulum swings earlier, but given these cars, and we saw it quite a few times across the weekend, given the weight that is in the back of those cars, as soon as you lose it, you just go straight round, and it looks a really unsettled car at the moment. So that will be, I think, the key thing that they're sitting there going, we need to address this. I mean, to paraphrase Christian Horner, fix your car. It's really quite concerning for them because, yes, we've seen that they can deliver a quick package, but the window in which they can is so thin. And I'm becoming increasingly concerned that George Russell's not going to be in the championship fight next season.
That's a really interesting comment you made, though, about the window of the car operating is almost becoming smaller and smaller, which is almost identical to what we saw with the W13, the W14. But Ian, the thing I want to come to is obviously the key word from Lewis following his accident was, of course, the term he used was the car was three-wheeling going into turn 19. And just also to build on something Sam said, obviously how Lewis got those 2 wins around the middle of the season, and kind of it felt like it's the perfect farewell for Hamilton and Mercedes. But now we're in this position where he's coming out of comments like he did after Cota, of accidents he's never experienced before. That's hardly. It does then throw the question. Actually, this farewell just isn't looking as good as perhaps some of the comments Mercedes have said is actually seeming to be.
Yeah, going to use Sam's phrase, pendulum swings, because you look at that midpoint of the season where Ferrari had its dip, McLaren seemed to be on the rise. They got 3 wins in 4 Grand Prix, 2 for Lewis, right? That fantastic victory at Silverstone, of course. And it was looking like, it doesn't look like Lewis has made the right decision here. He could be regretting this. Well, all of a sudden, a handful of Grand Prix later, as we approach the tail end of this season now, and it's Mercedes have completely dipped again. Ferrari's back on the rise, and all of a sudden we're talking about, Lewis is going to be thinking, made the right decision. It just goes to show the way this season has had so many swings and roundabouts for all of these teams, not just the top 4. If you go further down the grid as well, the way things have ebbed and flowed there between, Alpine, disastrous at the start, looking not too bad. Williams, Haas, they've made decent progress. RB in a fight with Haas for 6th place in the Constructors' Championship. Again, fluctuations between those 2 teams in particular. Now it looks like Haas that's on the rise, and RB just struggling a little bit. But absolutely, for Lewis and in particular, with the way that Ferrari is now performing, if it can maintain that form over these 5 Grand Prix, he's going to be in a very handy position going into Ferrari next season, because Ferrari could be the team to beat next season alongside McLaren. It could be. I'm already looking forward to next season, and we haven't got this one out of the way yet. It could be a real nip and tuck battle between those 2 if this form carries out of 24 and into 25.
It could be a real callback to the kind of halcyon days of the late 90s, early 2000s, a Ferrari McLaren scrap. I mean, I started watching F1 around that time, so I'm also really relishing the prospects.
I can't wait for it, but as we still have 5 races to go, let's continue talking about this season for now. We've got plenty of time to talk about 2020.
I was getting ahead of myself.
We've got a 3-month winter break to get through, so let's save the comments for a little bit. And let's talk about a topic I promised our viewers on Sunday we would discuss, and it's a 3-driver comment, because Liam Lawson, Sergio Perez, Yuki Tsunoda. Liam Lawson's return, of course, replacing Daniel Ricciardo for the remaining races this season, almost as an audition for, well, not just the RB but actually for Checo's Red Bull seat, it seems. And Lawson, a remarkable return on Sunday. Started in P19, finished in P9, only 11.5 seconds behind Perez, who finished in 7th. Yuki Tsunoda, P14, and, was even complaining of what was going on with his car. Sam, Liam is the real deal. I'm going to say it. That was from P19 to P9, to have been out of the car for a year, to been out of it. Yes, okay, he's done a bit of testing here and there, but to have been out of a competitive F1 situation for so long. I had a brilliant scrap with Fernando Alonso as well on the sprint, which led to some feisty comments from Fernando. But Liam looks comfortable yet again. And for a driver to have not been in the car for 1 year, to have then gotten back in and to have settled so quickly, but then to have looked so competitive so quickly, that's got to have made a few alarms go off at Red Bull, particularly when Checo was not only 40 seconds behind Max, a minute behind Leclerc, but only 11.5 seconds and 2 places up the road from Liam.
I think it's almost the opposite in terms of alarms going off at Red Bull. I reckon they're looking at it and going, oh, thank goodness.
It's validated our decision.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's one of those situations, and I'm glad you mentioned the off-track kind of the conversation, or I'd actually say scrap that it looked like he was having with Fernando in the paddock after the sprint. That informs how confident he is on track. For a guy to have not raced for a year, in his early 20s, and to be like, you know what, this guy's complaining about me. I'm giving my perspective. I'm giving it to him as good as I'm getting from, as good as I'm getting. That is really refreshing. It's also, it just underlines how confident and assured Liam is in his abilities. And, I get Fernando's frustration. Like, that scrap did ultimately in the sprint lose both of them position to Esteban Ocon. But for Liam to not wilt in that environment is so key. And you see the same thing on track. You're getting a very consistent Liam Lawson. And yeah, he was absolutely stellar, and he was last season as well. I think there's a lot of kind of revisionisms that happen over the course of a year. People say, oh, well, Yuki Tsunoda, he's taken a huge step this year, and actually he got unlucky in those 5 races. And will Liam be able to compete with Yuki? Yuki took a step forward at the start of 2023 as well. He was also strong throughout much of that year. And I think that when you contrast Liam versus, I think, Sergio, because I think that really is that's the ball game at this stage. Yes, Yuki can still get in that fight, and he's going to have to do more than he did at Kota. Questionable strategies aside, he did also have a spin. But Liam and Sergio's adrift. He's lost at sea. He's unable to work his way through the pack in a car that Max took a win in this weekend. And Liam has gone, you know what? I've been put at the back of the grid. I'm still going to get something from this race. And those points could be critical in RB's fight with Haas. So, yeah.
But it's interesting because actually you mentioned there about Sergio struggling to come through the pack. That used to be what he was so good at, was these recoveries from back in the pack and finishing in the top 5, top 4. It feels like, okay, yes, this is only one weekend for Liam. He's still got 5 more to go and needs to continue this form alongside Yuki and obviously in reference to Checo. But this now feels like, Ian, that it is very much not only an audition for Liam, but actually it's an audition for Checo, but for the complete opposite reasons, to retain his seat.
Yeah, a very valid point, to be honest, there, Nick, because we've discussed Checo in depth, not this past season. The way his form has just capitulated in many respects, and he makes so many excuses as to why he's not on the pace of Max. And I just get the impression now that your time's done, Checo. Sometimes a driver has to hold his hand up and appreciate when he can give no more. And I think Checo has reached that point in his career now when there is basically nothing left to give. As you rightly pointed out, we know Max is an exceptional driver, generational talent. And yes, it's always going to be very difficult for no matter who is in that other car alongside him in the garage to reach that kind of level. But what Red Bull is looking for is just to have a driver that can very much at least be a wingman to Max if he is going to be the lead driver to take the fight in the championships. And it hasn't had that this season. It had the standout car of last season, and Checo was at least able to deliver for the first time in Red Bull's history a second, 1-2 in the Drivers' Championship. However, he was so far adrift of Max, it beggared belief. And he's fallen even further back this season that it has reached a point that I do not believe Red Bull is going to retain its constructors' title this season. I definitely believe it's between McLaren and Ferrari over these 5 Grand Prix. And if that is the case, then Red Bull has to find a new second driver for next season, regardless of the fact that it's going to have to buy Checo out of that contract that he signed back in early June, and regardless of the fact of the multi-millions of dollars that he brings in via way of sponsorship. It has to now consider the fact that for the betterment of the team, of the organization, it needs a second driver that can deliver that Constructors' Championship or help deliver that Constructors' Championship year on year. It hasn't had that second driver this year. Sergio Perez has been an also-ran. And on the back of that performance from Liam Lawson, if he can continue to replicate that over these final 5 Grand Prix, he will be an absolute shoo-in for that second seat alongside Max next season. Again, I've no doubt about that.
And of course, this weekend is a massive weekend for Checo, being his home race where, he is treated like royalty, effectively, the reception. He receives one more driver I want to discuss before we do our bold predictions, because we need to race through this. It would be a discredit not to discuss Franco Colapinto, the driver who I think is just surprising us race after race. And I go back to the point we all raised our eyebrows when we saw him confirmed as the driver to replace Logan Sargent for the remainder of the season. Well, what a decision made by Williams and James Vowles. However, on the topic of Williams' decisions, surely they've got to be thinking, why did we confirm our driver lineup for 2025 when we did? Well, I guess hindsight is a wonderful and horrible thing, but Franco, again, a driver with actually pretty much no F1 experience, having a reasonable F2 campaign up to the point of jumping into Sargent's car. But we speak about generational talents like Max, and I'm not saying Franco's a generational talent potentially, but his talent quite clearly to be doing what he's doing in a mediocre package, let's say, because even Alex Albon's been struggling over recent races. Franco is doing something pretty incredible, and you've got to think, if there's any driver who deserves to be on the grid next season, it's Franco. I'll let one of you fight.
Go for it, Sam.
Franco definitely deserves to be in F1. Whether or not James Vowles and he will be able to get that worked out with the sole remaining seat that seems viable in Audi. RB could try and bring in Franco. Who knows whether or not James Vowles would be open to that, because he'd probably have to give him up to Red Bull. But yeah, he's been really, really strong. I think what's really telling for me is that whenever Logan Sargent had strong weekends, Alex Albon would have a better weekend. we are now seeing these moments, and this weekend is a prime example. Alex had an off weekend. Franco was there. He got a point on merit. And, Ian made a very good point before the show as well. Not going to take your point from you, Ian. I will give you due credit. Logan Sargent's 1 point for Williams came at Kota. Came at Kota last year, and that was inherited because of disqualifications for Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. Franco got his 5th point for the team in 5 races now on merit at the same venue, and that just shows the kind of light and day between the two teams. And I want to address it because I absolutely love the punchiness of your claim that Williams are going to be kind of going, did we confirm our driver lineup too soon? I don't think they will quite be feeling like that because, let's face it, Alex Albon has proven to be very strong, and same for Carlos Sainz. However, I do think they're going to feel very, very comfortable and kind of assured by the fact that if one of those guys does leave, they do have someone who they know they can put in the car who will be of a standard that they're happy with. So I think it's all win-win for Williams, how well Franco's performed.
Unless he snaps with someone else.
Yeah, well, yeah, because obviously you can imagine right now that, and we know James Vowles has been on the blower to Mattia Binotto.
Yeah.
Mattia Binotto must be looking at this and has been given considerable food for thought. Mattia has turned around and said that he's probably not going to make a decision now on his second driver at the stake team for next season, of course, becoming Audi in 2026 until mid-November. So that you would assume, therefore, that he was waiting and biding his time until after this triple header. And he would likely have looked at Franco Colapinto's performance again yesterday and thought, you know what, this kid's got something. And again, if Franco can reproduce that kind of form in Mexico and in Brazil, which I know is a race he's very much looking forward to because it's about as close as he can get to his Argentinian home, of course. And he has mentioned that as well, that is a race that he really wants to get to because he knows he's going to have a lot of fans there. If he can reproduce that form at these 2 races, then we could very well be hearing Franco Colapinto being announced as Nico Hülkenberg's teammate at stake for next season and going forward into Audi in 2026. And just think as well, the amount of interest that's been generated by Franco's arrival in South America and, of course, in Argentina in particular has been enormous. It's been overwhelming to such an extent. I actually had a comment from Franco over the weekend that he now believes that he's become the most popular driver in F1 in terms of fan following, simply on the basis of these past few Grand Prix alone. It's just like, wow, that's a bold thing to say, but it gives you some idea that he has captured the imagination of the South American public and obviously the Argentinian public in particular, because it has been such a long time since that country has had a driver on the grid. And we know that they are absolutely passionate about its Formula One, that they're desperate to get a Grand Prix back in that country as well. And as I say, if he is on the grid next season, then it will be on the basis of James Vowles taking a very bold decision by deciding to replace Logan Sargent after the Dutch Grand Prix with Franco Colapinto. And yes, I can imagine within James there's going to be a little bit of maybe, but they got the driver that they really wanted, which was Carlos Sainz. And if they can give, and in providing Franco this opportunity, if they can get him within a team, within Sauber stake next season, then I'm sure James will be absolutely delighted and be the first to congratulate Franco on that achievement.
The Argentinian Grand Prix returning to your screens in a couple of years. Guys, it is that time, and obviously for those who've been watching this podcast on YouTube, let us know your thoughts in the comment section below on anything we've discussed, but it's time for bold predictions for the Mexico City Grand Prix. I will get mine done nice and quick, and I'm going to say another Ferrari 1-2, but Carlos Sainz leading it ahead of Leclerc. Sam?
I think my bold prediction will be that Sergio Perez will have a similar weekend to Mexico last year. I think he'll go to his head. I think he'll make a mistake similar to that turn one incident. And also, to go even bolder, I don't know that he will necessarily still be in that Red Bull by the end of this triple header. I would be, if I was Red Bull, I'd be thinking, can we salvage this constructors title? Are we in this fight? Do we have someone who could help us? I think they'll be certainly asking the questions. Whether or not they actually make that, who knows? But I think Sergio Perez will have a bit of a mess of a weekend.
Sam Coop of not only a bold prediction, but an outlandishly bold prediction. That's going some. That's going to, if we do a reel at the end of the season of reflecting on our biggest bold predictions, I think that might be number one. But Ian, can you top that?
No, I was just going to say, actually, Nick, I think that's the boldest prediction we have all season
boldest of
long.
bold.
So, hats off to Sam for that one. If it does come to play, I'm gonna go with Liam Lawson, simply on the basis that I remember last season, Daniel Ricciardo produced arguably his best performance for what was then AlphaTauri / RB over his period of time over this team in that car last year. Liam showed us what he could do with his qualifying lap in Q1 on Saturday at COTA. And yes, I know there's the caveat that not every team is going full pelt in Q1, fuel loads, tyres, etc., etc. But nevertheless, he actually said himself over the radio, I just wanted to show you guys what I could do. And boy, did he show us what he could do. And I think if he could do that there at COTA, I think he can do something very similar at the Hermanos Rodriguez Autodromo this coming weekend. And I think he's going to be in the points, top 6.
Very, very interesting. Of course, for those watching this podcast, let us know your bold predictions in the comment section below. And thankfully, we've only got a couple of days to wait until we see, 1, what happens in Mexico City, and 2, if our bold predictions are correct. I've got a feeling Sam's might not be. From Racing News 36, 1 weekend of not working, look what it does to him. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast from Sam, Ian, and myself. We'll see you this weekend for the Mexico City Grand Prix. See you later.
And I'm going to do Nick's job and say, folks, don't forget to smash that subscribe button, because we do value your support. We do want you to subscribe to our channels, because at the end of the day, we also have lots of giveaways over the course of a Grand Prix season. So make sure you stay tuned for those. You hit that subscribe button, you'll be the first to know about them. And always, take care, folks.